A national standard language needed to be defined, measured, laid down, chased in silver, and carved in stone. Alterations to it then could be permitted or not, according to the mood of the great and the good. A home-grown 40, a national language authority. Swift was the fiercest advocate of all. He once wrote to the Earl of Oxford to express his outrage that words like bamboozle, uppish, and, of all things, couldn't, were appearing in print. He wanted the establishment of strict rules banning such words as offensive to good sense. In future he wanted all spellings fixed, a firm orthography, the correctness of writing. He wanted the pronunciations laid down, an equally firm orthoepy, the correctness of speech. Rules, rules, rules. They were essential, declared Gulliver's creator. The language should be accorded just the same dignity and respect as those other standards that science was then also defining. What is blue or yellow? Physicists were then wondering. How hot is boiling water? How long is a yard? How to define what musicians knew as middle C? What indeed of the precise measurements of longitude so vital to seamen? Enormous efforts were being made in this particular field at just the same time as the debate over the national language. A board of longitude had been set up by the government, funds were being dispersed, and prizes offered just so that a clock could be invented that would go to sea on a ship and be only almost imperceptibly inaccurate. Longitude was vitally important. So great a trading nation as Britain needed to have its ship's masters know exactly where they were. And so the thinking of great literary men went. If longitude was important, if the defining of colour, length, mass, and sound was vital, why was the same import not given to the national tongue? As one pamphleteer wailed appropriately, "We have neither grammar nor dictionary, neither chart nor compass, to guide us through the wide sea of words." No dictionary had proved adequate so far, said Swift and his friends, but given the heights of perfection that the language had already achieved, one was now needed, and a dedicated genius must be found and applied to the task of making one. It would accomplish two desirable deeds, the fixing of the language and the maintenance of its purity. Samuel Johnson could not have disagreed more. At least he wanted to have no truck with ordering the language to remain pure. He might have liked it too, but he knew it couldn't be done. As to whether he thought it possible or desirable to fix it, theses have tumbled by the score from academic presses in recent years, arguing variously that Johnson did want to, or that he did not. Consensus now is that he originally planned to make a fix on the tongue, but when he was halfway through his 6-year task, he came to realize that it was both impossible and undesirable. One of his predecessors, Benjamin Martin, explained why. No language, as depending on arbitrary use and custom, can ever be permanently the same, but will always be an immutable and fluctuating state, and what is deemed polite and elegant in one age may be accounted uncouth and barbarous in another. This dictum, which appeared in the preface to still another half-baked attempt at a proper dictionary just a year before Johnson brought out his own, might as well have guided the great Cham through his entire construction. For all the heady talk among London's intelligentsia, it was actually the free market that prompted Johnson to begin. In 1746 a group of 5 London booksellers, the famous Messrs. Longman among them, were seized with the idea that a brand-new dictionary would sell like hotcakes. They approached their favourite parliamentary writer, whom they knew to be both eager and broke, and made him an offer he could scarcely refuse. 1,500 guineas, half of it up front. Johnson agreed readily, with the sole caveat that he would seek as patron the man who was currently the arbiter of all that was good and worthwhile in literary England, Philip Dormer Stanhope, the 4th Earl of Chesterfield. Lord Chesterfield was one of the most remarkable figures in the land, an ambassador, a Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a friend of Pope, Swift, Voltaire, and John Gay. It was Chesterfield who had forced England to adopt the Gregorian calendar, and it was Chesterfield whose letters to his bastard son Philip Advising him on his behaviour became, when published, an indispensable vade-mecum of good manners. His imprimatur on the dictionary would be valuable, his patronage of the project invaluable. That he promised the imprimatur but declined the patronage, except for handing Johnson a draft for a measly £10, but then went on to claim a part in Johnson's subsequent triumph, became a source of well-publicised hard feelings. Lord Chesterfield, Johnson was to say later, taught the morals of a whore and the manners of a dancing-master. Chesterfield had the elephantine hide of a true aristocrat and brushed off the criticisms as good-natured, which they were not. His early advocacy of the dictionary, plus the 750 guineas that the booksellers had placed in Johnson's hand, nonetheless set the 37-year-old editor to work. He took rooms off Fleet Street, hired 6 serving men, 5 of them Scotsmen, which would come as some comfort to James Murray, who was from Howick, as amanuenses, and settled down to the 6 years of unremitting drudgery that were to prove necessary. He had decided, as Murray was to decide a century later, that the best way, indeed the only way, to compile a full dictionary was to read, to go through all literature and list the words that appeared on hundreds of thousands of pages. It is an axiom that you have 3 overlapping choices in making a word list. You may record words that are heard, you may copy the words from other existing dictionaries, or you may read, after which, in the most painstaking way, you record all the words you have read, sort them, and make them into a list. Johnson dismissed the first idea as far too cumbersome to be useful. He naturally agreed to the second. All lexicographers use earlier dictionaries as a starting point, to make sure they miss nothing. And, most significantly, he decided on the primary importance of the third choice, reading. Hence the taking of the rooms off Fleet Street, hence the buying or borrowing of books by the ton and the yard and the sack, and hence the hiring of the 6 men. A team of 7 had been created to browse and graze through all existing writings, and to make a catalogue of all that was swept into the team's collective maw. It was swiftly realized that it would be impossible to look through everything, and so Johnson imposed limits. The language, he decided, had probably reached its peak with the writings of Shakespeare, Bacon, and Edmund Spenser, and so there was probably precious little need to go look further back than their lifetimes. He ruled, therefore, that the works of Sir Philip Sidney, who was only 32 when he died in 1586, would usefully mark the starting point for his search, and the last books published by newly dead authors would mark the end. His dictionary would thus be the result of a concerted trawl through just a century and a half of writing, with the odd piece of Chaucer thrown in for good measure. So Johnson took down these books and read, then underlined and circled words he wanted, and annotated the pages he had chosen. He then demanded that his men copy onto slips of paper the full sentences that displayed his chosen words, and these he then filed, to use when necessary, to illustrate the point he was making, the meaning of a word that he was trying to show. And it was all those quoted meanings, a demonstration of the multiplicity of subtle shadings of sense that can be encompassed by the simple arrangement of a group of letters, that proved the great triumph of Johnson's dictionary. For while we might laugh at the quaint charm of his definition of elephant, or of oats, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people, or lexicographer, a writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge that busies himself in tracing the original and detailing the signification of words. We can only be staggered by his dealing with, say, the verb take. Johnson listed, with supportive quotations, no fewer than 113 senses of this particular verb's transitive form, and 21 of the intransitive. To seize, grasp, or capture, to catch with a hook, to catch someone in an error, to win popular favour, to be effective, to claim to do something, to assume the right, to mount a horse, to flee, to perform what one does in removing one's clothing. The list is almost endless. It was a mark of Samuel Johnson's genius that, armed with references from 150 years of English writings, he was able, and essentially single-handedly, to find and note almost every use of every word of the day, not simply take, but other common coin like set and do and go, and hundreds upon hundreds of others. Small wonder that once his project was well underway, and the trifling business of his creditors' needs arose, he once barred the door to the milkman with his bed, crying from behind the door, "Depend on it, I will defend this little citadel to the utmost." He finished amassing his list of the English word stock in 1750. He spent the next 4 years editing the citations and choosing the 118,000 illustrative quotations, sometimes by committing the heresy of changing quotes he didn't like. Finally, he completed the definitions of what were to become the 43,500 chosen head words. He wrote some of these definitions from scratch, or else he borrowed substantial passages for others from writers he admired, as with elephant, which was partly the work of a man named Calmet. He did not publish the completed work until 1755, however. He wanted to persuade Oxford University to grant him a degree, believing that if he was able to add it to his name on the title page, it would do Oxford, the book sales, and himself, and not necessarily in that order, a lot of good. Oxford agreed, and on April the 15th, 1755, there appeared a dictionary of the English language, in which the words are deduced from their originals and illustrated in their different significations by examples from the best writers, to which are prefixed a history of the language and an English grammar, by Samuel Johnson, A.M., in 2 volumes. The book, which went into 4 editions during Johnson's lifetime, was to remain the standard work, an unrivalled repository of the English language for the next century. It was an enormous commercial success, and was almost universally praised, particularly by the egregious Lord Chesterfield, who hinted that he had had rather more to do with the book's making than he had. This enraged Johnson. Not only did he mutter about whores and dancing masters, but he had up his sleeve the unkindest cut. Under the definition of patron he had written, "A wretch who supports with indolence and is paid with flattery." But the noble lord brushed this aside too, as lords are wont to do. There were some critics. The fact that Johnson allowed his own personality to invade the pages made a day seem pleasant whimsy, but to some who wanted the book to be supremely authoritative, it was irritatingly unprofessional. Many writers sniped at the limited authority of some of those whom Johnson quoted, a criticism that Johnson himself anticipated in his preface. Some found the definitions patchy, some trite, some unnecessarily complicated. As with network, anything reticulated or decussated at equal distances, with interstices between the intersections. A century after publication, the redoubtable Thomas Babington Macaulay was to damn Johnson as a wretched etymologist. But Macaulay aside, many of the critics were probably just jealous, envious that Johnson had done what none of them could ever do. "Any schoolmaster might have done what Johnson did," wrote one. "His dictionary is merely a glossary to his own barbarous works." But the writer was anonymous, and quite probably a disappointed rival, or else a rabid Whig. Johnson was a noted Tory, and wrote with what some thought a distinctive Tory bias. So the book was merely a vehicle for Jacobite and high-flying tracts, wrote one Whig, doubtless a die-hard. One woman even disparaged Johnson for failing to include obscenities. "No, madam, I hope I have not daubed my fingers," he replied archly. "I find, however, that you have been looking for them." Yet the accolades were many. Voltaire proposed that the French model a new dictionary of their own on Johnson's, and the venerable Accademia della Crusca wrote from Florence that Johnson's work will be a perpetual monument of fame to the author, an honour to his own country in particular, and a general benefit to the Republic of Letters throughout all Europe. In an age of dictionaries of all kinds, wrote a modern consideration, Johnson's contribution was simply primus inter pares, and Robert Birchfield, who edited the 4-volume supplement to the Oxford English Dictionary in the 1970s, had no doubts. Johnson managed to combine being both a lexicographer and a supremely literate man. In the whole tradition of the English language and literature, the only dictionary compiled by a writer of the first rank is that of Dr. Johnson. Throughout it all, under the reigns of slings, arrows, plaudits, and encomiums, Samuel Johnson remained calmly modest. Not unduly so, for he was proud of his work, but awed by the magnificence of the language he, with such foolhardiness, had chosen to tackle. The book remained his monument. James Murray was to say in later years that whenever someone used the phrase "the dictionary," as one might say "the Bible," or "the prayer book," he or she referred to the work by Dr. Johnson. But no, literature's great Cham would have said, in fact it was the words that were the truest monument, and even more profoundly the very entities that those words defined. "I am not yet so lost in lexicography," he says in his famous preface, "as to forget that words are the daughters of earth, and that things are the sons of heaven." His life had been devoted to the gathering in of those daughters, but it was heaven that had ordained their creation. Chapter 5. The Big Dictionary Conceived. Elephant. Forms A. 4 to 6. Ole. Olifant. 4 PL olifauns. Fonts. 4 olifant. Funt. 5 to 6. Olifant. E. 4 olifant. 5 to 6. Olifant. 4 to 7. Ole. Olifant. E. Beta. 4 elephants. 4 to 5. Elephant. E. 5. Elephant. 6. Elephant. 5 to 6. Elephant with an E. 6. Elephant. Middle English. Oliphant. A. Old French. Oliphant. Representing a popular L. Oliphant ou M, whence PR, Olifant. Compare Middle Dutch, Olfant. Breton, Olifant. Welsh, Olifant with 2 Fs. Cornish, Olifants, which may all be from Middle English or Old French. Corrupt form of Latin, Elephantum, Elephantem. Nominative Elephantus, Fas, Fans. Add and A, Greek, Eliphas, generally Elephantos. The refashioning of the word after Latin seems to have taken place earlier in English than in French, the French forms with EL being cited only from the 15th century. Of the ultimate etymology nothing is really known, as the Greek word is found, though only in sense ivory, in Homer and Hesiod. It seems unlikely that it can be, as some have supposed, of Indian origin. The resemblance in sound to Hebrew, Eleph, ox, has given rise to a suggestion of derivation from some Phoenician or Punic compound of that word. Others have conjectured that the word may be African. See Yule, Hobson-Jobson supplement, SV. For the possible relation to this word of the Teutonic and Slavonic name for camel, see Olfend. The origin of the corrupt Romanic forms with OL is unknown, but they may be compared with Latin oleum, oliva, and Greek elion, eloia. 1. A huge quadruped of the pachydermate order, having long, curving ivory tusks and a prehensile trunk or proboscis. Of several species once distributed over the world, including Britain, only 2 now exist, the Indian and African. The former, the largest of extant land animals, is often used as a beast of burden and in war. The achievements of the great dictionary makers of England's 17th and 18th centuries were prodigious indeed. Their learning was unrivalled, their scholarship sheer genius, their contributions to literary history profound. All this is undeniable, and yet, cruel though it seems even to venture to inquire, Who now really remembers their dictionaries, and who today makes use of all that they achieved? The question begs an inescapably poignant truth, of the kind that dims so many other pioneering achievements in fields that extend beyond, and are quite unrelated to, this one. The reality, as seen from today's perspective, is simply, however distinguished the lexicographical works of Thomas Eliot, Robert Corddry, Henry Cockerham, and Nathaniel Bailey, and however masterly and pivotal the creation of the great Cham, Samuel Johnson himself, their achievements seem nowadays to have been only stepping stones, and their magnificent volumes of work very little more than curios, to be traded, hoarded, and forgotten. And the reason for this is principally that in 1857, just over a century after the publication of the first edition of Johnson's dictionary, there came a formal proposal for the making of a brand-new work of truly stellar ambition, a lexicographical project that will be of far, far greater breadth and complexity than anything attempted before. It had as its goal a quite elegantly simple impertinence. While Johnson had presented a selection of the language, and an enormous selection at that, brilliantly fashioned, this new project would present all of it, every word, every nuance, every shading of meaning and spelling and pronunciation, every twist of etymology, every possible illustrative citation from every English author. It was referred to simply as the Big Dictionary. When conceived, it was a project of almost unimaginable boldness and foolhardiness, requiring great bravura, risking great hubris. Yet there were men in Victorian England who were properly bold and foolhardy, who were more than up to the implicit risks. This was, after all, a time of great men, great vision, great achievement. Perhaps no time in modern history was more suited to the launching of a project of such grandiosity, which is perhaps why, duly and ponderously, it got under way. Grave problems and seemingly intractable crises threatened more than once to wreck it. Disputations and delays surrounded it. But eventually, by which time many of those great and complicated men who first had the vision were long in their graves, the goal of which Johnson himself might have dreamed was duly attained. And while Samuel Johnson and his team had taken 6 years to create their triumph, those involved in making what was to be, and still is, the ultimate English dictionary, took 70 years, almost to the day. The Big Dictionary's making began with a speech at the London Library on Guy Fawkes' Day, 1857. Richard Genevieve Trench was officially designated by his contemporary obituarists as a divine, a term that is rarely used today, but that embraced all manner of good and eminent Victorians who pursued all kinds of callings and who wore the cloth while doing so. At the time of his death in 1886, Trench was still regarded more as a divine than anything else. He'd had a glittering ecclesiastical career that culminated in his being made Dean of Westminster and then Archbishop of Dublin. He also was lame because of breaking both his knees, not because of any excessive genuflective piety, however, but because he fell down a gangplank while crossing on the boat to Ireland. His theme on that lexicographically famous evening was intriguing, advertised on handbills and in flyers posted around London's West End. It was, "On some deficiencies in our English dictionaries." By today's standards, the title seems self-effacing, but given the imperial temper of the time and the firm belief that English was the quintessential imperial language, and that any books that dealt with it were important tools for the maintenance of the empire, the title offered an amply understandable hint of the impact that Dr. Trench would be likely to have. He identified 7 principal ways in which the dictionaries then available were to be found wanting. Most of them are technical and should not concern us here. But his underlying theme was profoundly simple. It was an essential credo for any future dictionary maker, he said, to realize that a dictionary was simply an inventory of the language, and decidedly not a guide to proper usage. Its assembler had no business selecting words for inclusion on the basis of whether they were good or bad. Yet all of the craft's earlier practitioners, Samuel Johnson included, had been guilty of doing just that. The lexicographer, Trench pointed out, was an historian, not a critic. It was not within the remit of one dictator, or 40, he added with a cheeky nod at Paris, to determine which words should be used and which should not. A dictionary should be a record of all words that enjoy any recognized lifespan in the standard language. And the heart of such a dictionary, he went on, should be the history of the lifespan of each and every word. Some words are ancient and exist still. Others are new and vanish like mayflies. Still others emerge in one lifetime, continue to exist through the next, and look set to endure forever. Others deserve a less optimistic prognosis. Yet all these types of words are valid parts of the English language, no matter that they are old and obsolete, or new and with questionable futures. Consider the golden question, said Trench. If someone needs to look up any word, then it should be there. For if not, the work of reference that book purports to be becomes a nonsense, something to which one cannot refer. Now he was warming to his theme. To chart the life of each word, he continued, to offer its biography, as it were. It is important to know just when the word was born, to have a record of the register of its birth. Not in the sense of when it was first spoken, of course. That, until the advent of the tape recorder, could never be known. But when it was first written down. Any dictionary that was to be based on the historical principles that, Trench insisted, were the only truly valid ones, had to have, for every word, a passage quoted from literature that showed where each word was used first. And after that, and also for each word, there should be sentences that show the twists and turns of meanings, the way almost every word slips in its silvery fish-like way, weaving this way and that, adding subtleties of nuance to itself, and then perhaps shedding them as the public mood dictates. A dictionary, Trench said, is an historical monument, the history of a nation contemplated from one point of view, and the wrong ways into which a language has wandered may be nearly as instructive as the right ones. Johnson's dictionary may have been among the pioneers in presenting quotations. An Italian, for example, claimed that his dictionary had already done so in 1598. But they were there only to illustrate meaning. The new venture that Trench seemed now to be proposing would demonstrate not merely meaning, but the history of meaning, the life story of each word. And that would mean the reading of everything and the quoting of everything that showed anything of the history of the words that were to be cited. The task would be gigantic, monumental, and, according to the conventional thinking of the times, impossible. Except that here Trench presented an idea that, to those ranks of conservative and frock-coated men who sat silently in the library on that dank and foggy evening, was potentially dangerous and revolutionary. But it was the idea that in the end made the whole venture possible. The undertaking of the scheme, he said, was beyond the ability of any one man. To peruse all of English literature, and to comb the London and New York newspapers, and the most literate of the magazines and journals, must be instead the combined action of many. It would be necessary to recruit a team, moreover a huge one, probably comprising hundreds and hundreds of unpaid amateurs, all of them working as volunteers. The audience murmured with surprise. Such an idea, obvious though it may sound today, had never been put forward before. But then, some members said, as the meeting was breaking up, it did have some real merit. It had a rough, rather democratic appeal. It was an idea consonant with Trench's underlying thought that any grand new dictionary ought to be itself a democratic product, a book that demonstrated the primacy of individual freedoms, of the notion that one could use words freely, as one liked, without hard and fast rules of lexical conduct. Any such dictionary certainly should not be an absolutist, autocratic product, such as the French had in mind. The English, who had raised eccentricity and poor organisation to a high art, and placed the scatterbrain on a pedestal, loathed such Middle European things as rules, conventions, and dictatorships. They abhorred the idea of diktats about the language, for heaven's sake, emanating from some secretive body of unaccountable immortals. Yes, nodded a number of members of the Philological Society, as they gathered up their astrakhan-collared coats and white silk scarves and top hats that night, and strolled out into the yellowish November fog. Dean Trench's notion of calling for volunteers was a good one, a worthy, and really rather noble idea. And it was also, as it happens, an idea that would eventually permit the involvement in the project of one scholarly but troubled lexicographer manqué. Assistant Surgeon, retired, U.S. Army, Brevet Captain William Chester, minor. This, however, was only the idea. It took 22 more years of sporadic and sometimes desultory activity before the new dictionary truly got off the ground. The Philological Society had already complicated matters. 6 months before Trench's famous speech, it had set up an unregistered words committee, had corralled, along with Trench, the boisterous Frederick Furnivall and Herbert Coleridge, the poet's grandson, to run it, and had planned to devote its corporate efforts to publishing a supplement dictionary of everything not found in the books that had already been published. It took many months for the enthusiasm behind that project to abate, though it was given a nudge by the swift realization that so many words were being uncovered in searches that any supplement would be far, far bigger than any book, even Johnson's, that was already available. Once that was behind them, the Society formally adopted the idea of a wholly new dictionary. January the 7th, 1858, when the plan was adopted, is normally reckoned the starting point, at least on paper. Furnivall then issued a circular calling for volunteer readers. They could select from which period of history they would like to read books, from 1250 to 1526, the year of the New English Testament, from then to 1674, the year when Milton died, or from 1674 to what was then the present day. Each period, it was felt, represented the existence of different trends in the development of the language. The volunteers' duties were simple enough, if onerous. They would write to the Society offering their services in reading certain books. They would be asked to read and make word lists of all that they read, and would then be asked to look, super-specifically, for certain words that currently interested the dictionary team. Each volunteer would take a slip of paper, write at its top left-hand side the target word, and below, also on the left, the date of the details that followed. These were, in order, the title of the book or paper, its volume and page number, and then below that the full sentence that illustrated the use of the target word. It was a technique that has been undertaken by lexicographers to the present day. Herbert Coleridge became the first editor of what was to be called a New English Dictionary on Historical Principles. He undertook as his first task what may seem prosaic in the extreme, the design of a small stack of oak-board pigeonholes, 9 holes wide and 6 high, which could accommodate the anticipated 60 to 100,000 slips of paper that would come in from the volunteers. He estimated that the first volume of the dictionary would be available to the world within 2 years. And were it not for the dilatoriness of many contributors, he wrote, clearly in a tetchy mood, I should not hesitate to name an earlier period. Everything about these forecasts was magnificently wrong. In the end, more than 6 million slips of paper came in from the volunteers, and Coleridge's dreamy estimate that it might take 2 years to have the first saleable section of the dictionary off the presses, for it was to be sold in parts to help keep revenues coming in, was wrong by a factor of 10. It was this kind of woefully naive underestimate of work, of time, of money, that at first so hindered the dictionary's advance. No one had a clue what they were up against. They were marching blindfolded through molasses. And Herbert Coleridge's early death slowed matters down even more. He died after only 2 years at work, at the age of 31, not even halfway through looking at the quotations of words beginning with A. He had been caught in the rain on the way to a Philological Society lecture, and he had sat through it in the unheated upstairs room on St. James's Square, caught a chill, and died. His last recorded words were, "I must begin Sanskrit tomorrow." Furnival then took over and threw all of his breezy energy and single-minded determination into his work, but in the same madcap, irresponsible manner that had already made him such legions of enemies. He had the bright and enduring idea of hiring a team of sub-editors, whom he would interpose between the volunteer readers, now gaily sending in their slips of paper with the necessary quotations, and the editor himself. The subs could check the incoming slips for accuracy and value, then sort them into bundles and place them in the pigeonholes. It would then be up to the editor to decide on the word he was going to do, take out from its place in the alphabetically arranged pigeonholes the bundle of quotations for that target word, and decide which of the quotations best suited his needs. Which one was the earliest? This was vitally important, of course, and which others thereafter demonstrated the slow progress of the word, as its meaning varied over the centuries, up to whatever was its primary meaning now. But Furnival presided over a project that, in spite of all of his energies and enthusiasm, started slowly but clearly to die. For some reason, never quite explained, Furnival had not the ginger to keep the hundreds of volunteers enthused, and so, slowly and steadily, they simply stopped reading, stopped sending in the slips. It seemed to many an insurmountable task. Many, in fact, sent back their books and the papers that Furnival had sent them to read. In 1879 alone, they'd returned 2 tons of material. The dictionary was well and truly stalled, perhaps a victim of its own massive ambition. Furnival's reports to the Society became shorter and shorter, his sculling expeditions with waitresses from the ABC longer and longer. In 1868, the Athenaeum, the journal that most closely followed the progress of the work, told its London readers that the general belief is the project will not be carried out. But it did not die. James Murray, it will be remembered, had been a member of the Philological Society since 1869. He'd already made a name for himself with publications on Scottish dialect, with huge editing tasks of Scottish poetry, and with noble but unfinished projects, such as a planned work on the declension of German nouns. He had left the Chartered Bank of India and had resumed his beloved teaching, this time at the distinguished London public school, Mill Hill. Furnival, who, though clearly committed to the dictionary, simply lacked the personal qualities necessary to lead it, thought Murray a perfect choice as editor. He approached Murray and others of the Society too. Would not this astonishing young man, Murray was then just over 40, not be the ideal candidate? And moreover, would not the Oxford University Press, with its academic distinction, comparatively deep pockets, and a flexible view of literary time, be the ideal house to publish the work? Murray was persuaded to produce some specimens sheets, suggestions of how the work might look. He chose the words arrow, carouse, castle, and persuade, and in the late autumn of 1877 the pages were duly sent off to Oxford, to the press's notoriously difficult delegates, essentially the Board of Directors, who were infamous for being dauntingly highbrow, irritatingly pedantic, and fiscally mean. Furnival continued to meet other publishers and printers. The house of Macmillan was at one time deeply involved, but backed out after a dispute with Furnival, and made endlessly certain that the big dictionary remained on everybody's mind. The twin notions of selecting the right editor and the proper publisher continued to vex the lexicographical and commercial literary establishments of England for the final years of the 70s. Oxford's delegates first dismayed everyone by saying that they cared little for Murray's specimens. They wanted more proof that Murray had looked hard enough for quotations for his 4 chosen words. They said they didn't like the way he'd offered the words' pronunciations, and they dithered about whether or not his etymological section should be omitted, not least because they were already publishing a quite separate and scholarly etymological dictionary of their own. In exasperation, Murray and Furnivall looked hopefully toward the Cambridge press, but the syndics there, the local equivalent of the Oxford delegates, offered only a brusque rebuff. Lobbying went on in common rooms and London clubs, week after week, and as time passed, so Oxford slowly became persuaded that changes could be made, that the powers that be might ultimately find the pages of the proposed book to be acceptable, that Murray might well be the man, and that the big dictionary could in fact one day have the commercial and intellectual appeal that Oxford wanted. It was finally on April 26, 1878, that James Murray was invited up to Oxford for the first meeting with the delegates themselves. He had come expecting to be terrified of them. They imagined they would be dismissive of him. But to everyone's surprised delight, he found that he rather liked the grand old men who sat in that great Oxford boardroom, and more to the point, they discovered in short order that they very much liked him. The upshot of the meeting was the delegates' decision, in a moment of subdued and characteristically Oxonian jubilation, celebrated with a glass or two of indifferent dry sherry, to proceed. Arguments over the details of the contract, which were often bitter, but were rarely conducted in person by a decidedly otherworldly James Murray, though his hard-headed wife Ada did have things to say, took another full year. Finally, on March 1, 1879, almost a quarter of a century after the speech by Richard Chenevix Trench, a document was formally agreed upon. James Murray was to edit, on behalf of the Philological Society of London, the new English Dictionary on Historical Principles, which would spread itself across an estimated 7,000 quarto pages in 4 thick volumes, and take 10 years to complete. It was still a woeful underestimate, but the work was now beginning properly, and this time it was never to stop. Within days, Murray had made 2 decisions. First, he would build a corrugated iron shed on the grounds of Mill Hill School. He would call it the Scriptorium, the first of his 2 specially built headquarters, and would edit the great dictionary from there. And second, he would write and have published a 4-page appeal to the English-speaking and English-reading public for a vast, fresh corps of volunteers. The committee, he declared, want help from readers in Great Britain, America, and the British colonies to finish the volunteer work so enthusiastically commenced 20 years ago by reading and extracting the books which still remained unexamined. The 4 sheets of paper, 8 pages of writing, went out to the magazines and newspapers of the day, which regarded them as a press release and published such parts as seemed likely to interest their readers. They went out also to bookshops and newsstands, and assistants handed them to customers. Librarians handed them out as bookmarks, and there were small wooden cases in shops and libraries from which the public could take them and read them. Before long they'd found wide circulation all around the United Kingdom and its various dominions, old and new. And sometime in the early 1880s, 1 copy at least, left inside a book or slipped between the pages of a learned journal, found its way to one of 2 large cells on the top floor of Block 2 of the Broadmoor Asylum for the Criminally Insane in Crowthorne, Berkshire. It was read voraciously by William Minor, a man for whom books, with which one of his 2 cells was lined from floor to ceiling, had become a second life. Dr. Minor had been an inmate at Broadmoor for the previous 8 years. He was deluded, true, but he was a sensitive and intelligent man, a graduate of Yale, and well-read and curious. He was, understandably, preternaturally anxious to have something useful to do, something that might occupy the weeks and months and years and decades that stretched without limit, until Her Majesty's pleasure be known before him. This invitation from a Dr. James Murray of Mill Hill, Middlesex, North-West, it seemed, promised an opportunity for intellectual stimulus, perhaps even a measure of personal redemption. It was far better than any he could otherwise imagine. He would write immediately. He took down paper and a pen, and in a firm hand wrote his address, Broadmoor, Crowthorne, Berks. Perfectly ordinary address. To anyone who did not know any better, it was merely a means of describing an ordinary house, in an ordinary village, in a prettily rural royal county just beyond the boundaries of London. To anyone who did not know any better, it was merely a means of describing an ordinary house, in an ordinary village, in a prettily rural royal county just beyond the boundaries of London. And even if someone outside did know the word asylum, the sole definition that was available at the time was quite innocent in its explanation. The meaning was to be found in Johnson's dictionary, naturally. A place out of which he that has fled to it may not be taken. An asylum was to Dr. Johnson no more than a sanctuary, a refuge. William Chester minor was quite content to be seen to write from inside such a place, just so long as no one looked too closely for the deeper and more sinister meaning that the word was then gathering to itself in the hard times of Victorian England. Chapter 6. The Scholar in Cell Block 2. Bedlam. Forms 1 to 3, Bethlehem, 3, Bethlehem, 3 to 6, Bethalim, 4, Bedlehem, 4 to 8, Bethlem, 6, Bethlehem, 3 to 7, Bedlem, 5, Bedelem, 6, Bedlehem, 6 to 7, Bedlame, 6, Bedlam. Middle English, Bedlem equals Bethlem, Bethlehem, applied to the Hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem in London, founded as a priory in 1247, with the special duty of receiving and entertaining the Bishop of St. Mary of Bethlehem, and the canons, etc., of this, the Mother Church, as often as they might come to England. In 1330 it is mentioned as an hospital, and in 1402 as a hospital for lunatics, Thames. In 1346 it was received under the protection of the City of London, and on the dissolution of the monasteries it was granted to the mayor and citizens, and in 1547 incorporated as a royal foundation for the reception of lunatics. Thence the modern sense, of which instances appear early in 16th century. 2. The Hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem, used as an asylum for the reception and cure of mentally deranged persons, originally situated in Bishopsgate, in 1676 rebuilt near London Wall, and in 1815 transferred to Lambeth. Jack, or Tom, a bedlam, a madman. 3. By extension, a lunatic asylum, a madhouse. Minor, William Chester, a thin, pale, and sharp-featured man with light sandy-coloured hair, deep-set eyes and prominent cheekbones. He is 38 years old, of superior education, indeed a surgeon, but of no known religion. He weighs 10 stone 1 pound, and is formally classified as being dangerous to others. He was charged with the wilful murder of one George Merritt of Lambeth, was found not guilty on the grounds of insanity. He says he has been the victim of persecution for years, the victim of the lower classes in whom he has no faith. Persons unknown are trying to injure him with poison. So begin the case notes for Broadmoor patient 742, based on an examination conducted in the afternoon of the day he was admitted, Wednesday, April 17, 1872. Guards had brought him there in shackles, along with another murderer, a man who was classified too insane to be tried, named Edmund Dainty. Both had been waiting in jail at Newington in Surrey until the necessary papers had been brought down from London. They were brought first by steam train to the small red-brick Gothic railway station that had been built by and then named for Wellington College, one of the great schools of southern England which stood nearby. A black Broadmoor landau, its roof closed, then took Minor and his escorts through the narrow, leafy lanes winding around the tiny village. The horses were sweating slightly as they hauled the four-wheel vehicle and its occupants up the low sandstone hill, at the top of which stands Broadmoor itself. The special hospital, as it is called today, still looks a forbidding place, even though much of what must have rendered it quite terrifying in Victorian times is now hidden discreetly behind its high, smoothly round-topped, modern maximum security walls. In 1872, Dr. Miner came to the original front gate, 2 triple-storied towers with heavily barred windows, with an imposing archway between, topped by a large black-faced clock. The arch was closed by a massive pair of green outer wooden doors. A peephole in one snapped open at the sound of the horses' hooves. The doors swung back to reveal another set of heavy gates, 10 yards deeper into the asylum. The landau moved swiftly inside, the front doors were slammed closed and bolted hard, and the lights in the dim and cavernous reception area were switched on. Dr. Miner was ordered to step out to be searched. His chains were removed to be taken back to Surrey. The escorting tipstaff, the Broadmoor bailiff, handed over the papers, a long warrant in elegant copperplate, above the signature of Henry Austin Bruce, Her Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for the Home Department. The asylum superintendent, a kindly and sympathetic man named William Orange, had his deputy sign the receipt. Dr. Miner was led through the second set of gates and into Block 4, the admissions building. He heard the horses turn around, heard his escort clamber up into the carriage and order the driver to return to the railway station. He heard the outer gates open to let the carriage out, and then close again. There was a resounding second crash as the inner metal gates shut and were bolted and chained. He was now formally and properly a Broadmoor inmate, confined in what would probably be his home for the rest of his natural life. It was a fairly new home, however. Broadmoor had been open just 9 years. It had been built because the state's main lunatic asylum, the Hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem, from which we have the word Bedlam for a madhouse, was now full to bursting. By coincidence, it was located in Lambeth, less than a mile from the murder site. Legal recognition of criminal madness had been established by Parliament in 1800, and judges had for the past half-century been dispatching into asylums and sentencing to stay there until the monarch's pleasure be known. Scores of men and women who would hitherto have been sent to ordinary prisons. The Victorians, with their characteristic mix of severity and enlightenment, believed the inmates could both be kept securely away from the public, to whom they were so dangerous, and properly treated. But the Enlightenment only went so far, while nowadays the Broadmoor inmates are patients, and Broadmoor itself a special hospital. A century ago there was no mincing of words. The inmates were lunatics and criminals. They were treated by alienists and mad doctors. And Broadmoor was indubitably an asylum, in which they were firmly imprisoned. Broadmoor certainly looked and felt, and was meant to look and feel, like a prison. It had been designed by a military architect, Sir Joshua Jebb, who had previously created 2 of England's darkest high-security penitentiaries, Pentonville and Dartmoor. It had long, gaunt cell blocks, severe and intimidating. All the buildings were of dark red brick. All the windows were barred. There was a huge wall, topped with iron spikes and broken glass. The institution slouched, crab-like, ugly and forbidding on top of its hill. Villagers would look up toward it and shudder. They tested the escape sirens every Monday morning. The banshee wails that echoed and re-echoed across the hills were spine-chilling. People said the birds remained silent, frightened for many minutes afterwards. But Dr. Miner, an American murderer, where to put him? The normal practice, which, to judge from his case notes, was almost certainly followed in Miner's case, was to spend several early days asking the newcomer about himself, and then, if he wanted to discuss it, about the crime that had caused him to be sent there. One newcomer, asked why he'd killed his wife and children, told the superintendent, "I don't know why I'm telling you all of this. It's none of your business. As a matter of fact, it was none of the judge's business either. It was a purely family affair." Emphasis added. Once that was duly accomplished, It was then standard Broadmoor practice never again to ask about the crime. The superintendent decided which of the 6 male blocks — there were 2 others for women, securely fenced off from the men — was most suitable. If the patient was judged suicidal, and his records were thereafter written on pink cards, not white, he was put in a cell in Block 6, where there were extra staff members to observe him all the time. If he was diagnosed epileptic, he was put in another cell in the same block, a special cell that had padded walls and a wedge-shaped pillow on which he could not suffocate himself during a fit. If he was thought to be dangerous and violent, he was also shut up in Block 6, or maybe the slightly smaller staffed Block 1, the 2 being known variously as the strong blocks, the disturbed blocks, or more recently the refractory blocks. Then, as now, the 2 buildings, grimmer and gaunter than the rest, were known among the inmates as the back blocks, because they have no view over the landscape. They're secure, tough, miserable. After the first few days of interrogations, the Broadmoor doctors realized that their new charge, a doctor himself, after all, was neither epileptic, nor liable to kill himself, nor sufficiently violent to do anyone an injury. So he was sent to Block 2, a relatively comfortable wing that was usually kept for parole patients. It was called the swell block, a word used in the British sense, meaning it tended to be occupied by swells. A visitor once wrote that Block 2 had an atmosphere described by someone familiar with both as identical with that of the Athenaeum Club. It is difficult to imagine that too many members of this most genteel of London's gentlemen's clubs, which included on its rolls most of the bishops and learned men of the land, were thrilled by the comparison. Yet Minor was made more than just tolerably comfortable, not least because he was a well-born, well-educated man. And he had an income. All the Broadmoor officials knew he was a retired soldier, with a regular army pension paid from the United States. So he was given not 1 cell, but 2, a pair of connecting rooms at the south end of the block's top floor. The rooms were kept unlocked by day. At night, any medicines and food he might need were handed in through a long vertical slot, too narrow for an arm to reach out, with a lockable door on its outer side. The windows had iron bars on the inside, but to compensate there was an enchanting view, a long, shallow valley of cattle-filled meadows, with the cows standing in the shadow of great oak trees, the Broadmoor tennis courts and a small cricket ground to one side, a line of low blue hills crowned with beeches in the distance. On that early spring day, with clear skies and lilacs and apple blossom and the songs of larks and thrushes, perhaps the sentence may not have seemed altogether a nightmare. At the north end of the corridor sat the guard, known at the asylum as an attendant, who kept watch over the 20 men on his floor. He had keys, presided over the ever-locked door to the floor itself, and would let them in and out of their rooms to visit the bathroom. And during the day he kept a small gas flame burning from a brass jet beside him. The men were not allowed matches. This is where they came to light their cigarettes or their pipes, from the tobacco ration they were handed each week. The tobacco all came from Her Majesty's Customs Service. Anything confiscated as contraband at the ports was handed over to the Home Office for distribution at the prisons and the state lunatic asylums. Within days, the American vice-consul was writing, making sure that the hapless army officer was being well looked after. Might it be possible for our poor friend, he prayed, to have some of his personal effects sent down? They'd been left at the consulate to help pay any of the diplomat's expenses at court. Is it in theory possible to visit? To cheer him up, could we send him a pound of Dennis's coffee and some French plums? Mr. Orange was silent on the specific matter of plums, but told the consul that Dr. Minor could have whatever he liked, so long as it didn't prejudice his safety or the asylum's disciplined running. So a week later the official sent up a leather portmanteau by rail. It held a frock coat and 3 waistcoats, 3 pairs of drawers and 4 undervests, 4 shirts, 4 collars, 6 pocket handkerchiefs, a prayer book, a box of photographs, 4 pipes, cigarette papers, a bag of tobacco, a map of London, a diary, and a fob watch and gold chain. The last a family heirloom, it had been said during the trial. Most important of all, the superintendent reported later, the doctor was given back his drawing materials, a cheap deal drawing box and its contents, a paint box and a collection of pens, a drawing board, sketchbooks, and painting cards. He would now be able to occupy his time constructively, which all patients were encouraged to do. Over the succeeding months, Miner furnished his cells comfortably, much, indeed, as a member of the Athenaeum might. He had money. His officer's pension of about $1,200 a year was paid to his brother Alfred in Connecticut. He acted for William, whom the state had designated an incapable person, who regularly telegraphed funds to England to keep his sick brother's running account up to date. Using this constant credit, Dr. Miner satiated his one consuming passion, books. He demanded first that his own books be sent over from home in New Haven. Once they were installed, he ordered from the big London bookstores scores upon scores of new and second-hand volumes, which he first stacked in precarious piles in his cells until he asked, and paid for, bookshelves to be built. In the end, he had converted the more westerly of the 2 rooms into a library, with a writing desk, a couple of chairs, and floor-to-ceiling teak bookshelves. He kept his easel and his paints in the other easterly room. He also kept a small selection of wines and some bourbon, with which the consul kept him supplied. He took up the flute again and gave lessons to some of his neighbour inmates. He also found that he was permitted, and was well able to afford, to pay one of his fellow patients to perform work for him, tidying his room, sorting his books, cleaning up after a painting session. Life, which in those first months had been at least tolerable, now started to become really quite agreeable. William Miner was able to live a life of total leisure and security. He was warm and reasonably well fed. His health was attended to. He could stroll along the long gravel pathway known as the terrace. He could take his ease on one of the benches by the lawn and gaze at the shrubbery, or he could read and paint to his heart's content. His cells still exist. Not much at Broadmoor has changed in a century, and although Block 2 is now called Essex House, it is still much preferred for those patients who are in for the long haul. One of the 2 rooms, the westerly of the pair where Dr. Miner maintained his library, houses a patient whose violent propensities are readily apparent. The room is littered with magazines devoted to bodybuilding. Posters on the wall celebrate the achievements of Rambo-like figures. There are technical drawings of large American motorcycles, and a slogan torn from a comic book has been pasted onto the cell door. It says, "Mad Killer." The other room, where Miner painted, was by contrast so tidy that it looked almost unoccupied. The bed was so well made that one could have bounced the proverbial coin on its taut surface. Leather shoes were neatly arranged and polished. Clothes were hanging neatly in the wardrobe. There were no books, nothing on the walls. The fireplace had long since been boarded up, although there was a mantel which had a small desk calendar. The room's occupant, I was told, was an Egyptian. Dr. Miner's sanity, or lack thereof, was never in doubt. He was never so ill as to be ordered away from the benign atmosphere of Block 2 and into the harsher regime of the back blocks. Though a strange and terrible incident in 1902 did take him away from his rooms for many weeks. But the ward notes show that his delusions became over the years ever more fixed, ever more bizarre, and that there seemed no likelihood that he would ever regain his reasoning. He was comfortable in Broadmoor, maybe, but there was nowhere else he could be allowed to live. The ward notes from his first 10 years show the sad and relentless progress of his downward spiral. Already at the time he was admitted, he had a detailed awareness of the curious happenings that plagued him at night. Always at night. Small boys, he believed, were put up in the rafters above his bed. They came down when he was fast asleep, chloroformed him, and then forced him to perform indecent acts. Though whether with them as boys, or whether with the women of whom he dreamed constantly, The record-keepers were never clear. He claimed he would awaken with abrasions around his nose and mouth where they'd clamped the gas bottle. The bottoms of his pyjama legs were always damp, he said, indicating he had been forced to walk in a stupor through the night. April 1873. Dr. Miner is thin and anemic, excitable in manner, though appears rational by day, and occupies himself with painting and playing the flute. But at night he barricades the door of his room with furniture, and connects the handle of the door with the furniture, using a piece of string, so that he will awaken if anyone tries to enter the bedroom. June 1875. The doctor is convinced that intruders manage to get in, from under the floor or through the windows, and that they pour poison into his mouth through a funnel. He now insists on being weighed each morning to see if the poison has made him heavier. August 1875. The expression of his face in the morning is often haggard and wild, as though he did not obtain much rest. He complains that he feels as if a cold iron has been pressed against his teeth at night, and that something is being pumped into him. Otherwise no change. A year later the demons were seeming to have a depressing influence. In February 1876 the doctors noted, "A fellow patient stated today that Dr. Miner came to see him in the boot room and said he would give him everything if only he would cut his, Dr. Miner's, throat. An attendant was ordered to look after him." The following year was no better. Socially, he was reported as explaining to an attendant in May 1877, "All systems are based on schemes of corruption and knavery, and he is the subject of their machinations. This lies at the heart of the brutal torture to which he is subjected each night. His spinal marrow is pierced, and his heart is operated on with instruments of torture. His assailants come through the floor." In 1878, technology became a part of the villainy. "Electric currents from unseen sources are passed through his body," he insists. "Electric buttons are placed on his forehead. He is placed in a wagon and trundled across the countryside." He was taken as far afield as Constantinople, he told an attendant once, where he's made to perform lewd acts in public. "They are," he declared, "trying to make a pimp of me." But while the delusions clearly persisted and worsened over those early asylum years, the clinical notes do show, and crucially to this story, the parallel development of a more thoughtful and scholarly side to the afflicted man. "With the exception of his impressions on the subject of his nighttime visitations," says one entry in the late 1870s, "he talks very coherently and intelligently on most topics. He works in his bit of garden, and is fairly cheerful just now, but he has his days of moodiness and reserve." A year later a doctor records simply, "He's rational and intelligent for the most part." He also begins to settle down, starting to regard the great hospital as his home and the attendants as his family. "He's not particularly aware that he is anxious to go back to America, as at one time he was," writes another doctor. "All he asks is a little bit more freedom, perhaps to go and see sights in London, or perhaps visit the orchid show for which he had just received a card." Yet the doctor who conducted this particular interview was certain of his patient's condition, and inscribed a sentence which seems, in hindsight, almost to have sealed William Miner's eternal fate. "There can be no doubt that Dr. Miner, though on occasion very calm and collected, is, generally speaking, more abundantly insane, and shows himself to be more so than he was some years ago. He has the calm and firm conviction that he is almost nightly the victim of torment and purposive annoyance, on the parts of the attendants and others connected with an infernal criminal scheme." It was at about this time that there came two developments, one of which by chance led indirectly to the other. The first stemmed from a factor that is not uncommon among those who commit appalling crimes. Miner became truly remorseful for what he'd done, and resolved to try and make some kind of amends. It was with this in mind that he took the bold step of writing to his victim's widow via the American embassy, which he knew had helped raise a fund for her in the months immediately following the tragedy. He explained to Eliza Merritt how immeasurably sorry he was for what he'd done, and he offered to try to help in any way he could, perhaps by settling money on her or her children. Already Miner's stepmother Judith had contributed. Now, perhaps, and if Mrs. Merritt would only be so gracious as to accept, he could do rather more. The letter seems to have worked a small miracle. Not only did Mrs. Merritt agree to accept financial help from Miner, she also asked if it might be possible to visit him. It was an unprecedented request that an incarcerated murderer be allowed to spend time with a relative of his victim. But the Home Office, after discussing the matter with Dr. Orange, agreed to one experimental supervised visit. Accordingly, sometime during late 1879, Mrs. Eliza Merritt travelled up from Lambeth to Broadmoor and first met the man who had ended her husband's life 7 years before, and who had so drastically changed her own life and the lives of her 7 children. The meeting, according to Dr. Orange's notes, was at first tense, but it progressed well, and by its end Mrs. Merritt had agreed to come again. All along she was making monthly ventures down to Crowthorne, eager to talk with interested sympathy to this now seemingly harmless American. And though the conversations apparently stopped short of developing into any real friendship, it is believed that she made Miner an offer that was to lead to the second of the major developments of this period of his life. She agreed, it seems, to bring parcels of books to Miner from the antiquarian dealers in London. Eliza Merritt knew very little of books. Indeed, she was barely literate. But when she saw how keenly Dr. Miner collected and cherished his old volumes, and when she listened to his querulous remarks about the delays and costs of the postal service between London and Crowthorne, she made an offer to collect his orders for him and bring them down on her visits. And so it happened that, month after month, Mrs. Merritt began delivering packages, wrapped in brown paper and sealed with twine and wax, from the West End's great book emporiums like Maggs, Bernard Quaritch, and Hatchard's. The delivery system, such as it was, probably remained in place for only a few months. Mrs. Merritt eventually took to drink, and apparently lost all interest in the curious and eccentric unfortunate. But the system appears, during its brief life, to have led what was undeniably the most serendipitous event in William Miner's otherwise melancholy life. For it was in the early 1880s that he stumbled across the first of James Murray's famous appeals for volunteers, which asked for interested parties to indicate that they might be prepared to work on the new dictionary. Murray first published his appeal in April 1879, and had 2,000 copies printed and circulated by booksellers. One would almost certainly have found its way, probably fairly soon after its distribution, into one or more of the packages that Mrs. Merritt brought to Miner at the asylum. The 8 pages explained in very broad terms what was likely to be wanted. First, there were Murray's own suggestions for the kind of books that needed to be read. In the early English period, up to the invention of printing, so much has been done and is doing that little outside help is needed. But few of the earliest printed books, those of Caxton and his successors, have yet been read, and anyone who has the opportunity and time to read one or more of these, either in the originals or accurate reprints, will confer valuable assistance by so doing. The later 16th century literature is very fairly done, yet here several books remain to be read. The 17th century, with so many more writers, naturally shows still more unexplored territory. The 19th century books, being within the reach of everyone, have been read widely, but a large number remain unrepresented, not only of those published during the last 10 years while the dictionary has been in abeyance, but also of earlier date. But it is in the 18th century, above all, that help is urgently needed. The American scholars promised to get the 18th century literature taken up in the United States, a promise which they appear not to have any extent fulfilled, and we must now appeal to English readers to share the task, for nearly the whole of that century's books, with the exception of Burke's works, have still to be gone through. After this, Murray listed rather more than 200 specific authors whose works, in his view, were essential reading. The list was quite awesome. Most of the volumes were rare, and likely to be in the hands of only a very few collectors. Some books, on the other hand, were already available at Murray's newly established dictionary library at Mill Hill. They could be sent to readers who promised to do work on them, and vouched to return them. When Henry Furnivall had been editor, he found that a number of disgruntled readers used the lending scheme as a means of swelling their own library collections, and neither sent in the requested quotation slips nor ever returned the books. Dr. Minor was clearly in one of his more scholarly, reflective, and positive moods when he read the pamphlet. He responded with alacrity and enthusiasm. He wrote to James Murray almost immediately, formally volunteering his services as a reader. It is not wholly clear, though, just when this was, not clear exactly when Minor first started his legendary work. Murray recalled later that he'd received Minor's letter very soon after I commenced the dictionary. No correspondence between the Doctor and the dictionary has been traced, however, until 1885, which is hardly very soon. But one clue exists. There had been an article in the Athenaeum magazine in September 1879 suggesting that Americans might like to become more keenly involved, and it is quite probable that Minor, who is known to have subscribed to the magazine in Broadmoor, would have seen it. Based on this assumption, on Murray's recollections, and on the records of Minor's contributions that have lately been unearthed in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, it seems probable that his relationship with the dictionary got underway in 1880 or 1881. But where did Murray think his correspondent was living, and what did he think he did? Murray told his correspondent that he remembered only that the first and subsequent letters from Minor had been addressed to the dictionary office, simply from Broadmoor, Crowthorne, Berkshire. Murray was too busy to ruminate on the matter, no matter how curiously familiar the address might have been. By the time he read Minor's first letter, he'd already received about 800 similar letters in response to his appeal. He was being swamped by the success of his entreaty. He replied to Minor with his characteristic courtesy, saying that on the basis of his apparent qualifications, enthusiasm, and interest, he should start reading immediately, going through any of the volumes he might already have, or else looking to the dictionary office for copies of books he might require. In due course, Murray continued, the Doctor could expect to receive particular word requests, in the particular event that the dictionary editors had trouble finding quotations for a specific word on their own. For the time being, however, Dr. Minor and all the other early respondents, to whom the editor expressed his considerable gratitude, should just start reading and should start making word lists and writing quotations, in a careful, systematic, but general way. 2 additional sheets of printed paper Murray was enclosing with the letter, which underlined a formal agreement that Dr. Minor had been officially welcomed as a volunteer reader, would offer any necessary further advice. But through all this, James Murray explained some years later, I never gave a thought to whom Minor might be. I thought he was either a practising medical man of literary tastes with a good deal of leisure, or perhaps a retired medical man or surgeon who had no other work. The truth about his new American correspondent was a great deal stranger than this detached, innocent, and otherworldly Scotsman could have ever imagined. Chapter 7. Entering the Lists. Catch word. From catch, 3b plus word. 1. Printing. First word of the following page inserted at the right-hand lower corner of each page of a book, below the last line. Now rarely used. 2. A word so placed as to catch the eye or attention. Specifically, A, the word standing at the head of each article in a dictionary or the like. 1879. Directions to readers for dict. Put the word as a catchword at the upper corner of the slip. 1884. Athenaeum, 26th of January, 124/2. The arranging of the slips collected and the development of the various senses of every catchword. The 2 small, closely printed sheets that came as an addendum to Murray's first letter turned out to be a set of meticulously worded instructions. When his morning mail was delivered by the ward staff that day, Miner must have fallen upon this one envelope eagerly, reading and rereading its contents. But it was not the content alone that fascinated him. A list of rules for dictionary helpers was not the cause of his excitement. It was the simple fact that they had been sent to him in the first place. The letter from James Murray represented, in Miner's view, a token of the further forgiveness and understanding that Eliza Merritt's visits to him had already suggested. The invitation seemed a long-sought badge of renewed membership in the society from which he'd been so long estranged. By being sent these sheets of rules, he was, he felt, being received back into a corner of the real world. A corner that admittedly was still housed in a pair of cells in an alien madhouse, but one that had firmly forged links to the world of learning and connections with a more comfortable reality. After a decade of languishing in the dark slough of imprisonment, intellectual isolation and remove, Miner felt that at last he was being hoisted back up onto the sunlit uplands of scholarship. And with what he saw as this re-enlistment in the ranks, so Miner's self-worth began, at least marginally, to re-emerge, to begin seeping back. From the little evidence that survives in his medical records, he appears to have started recovering his confidence and even his contentment, both with every moment that he spent reading Murray's acceptance letter, and then when he prepared to embark on his self-set task. For a while, at least, he seemed truly happier. Even the sternly worded Victorian ward notes of the day hint that the temper of this usually suspicious, broody, prematurely elderly-looking middle-aged man, who was now approaching 50, had somehow started to turn. His personality was undergoing, even if only for a short while, a sea change, and all because, at long last, he had something valuable to do. Yet in its very value lay a problem, as Miner saw it. The doctor swiftly came to realize, and was daunted by the realization, the simple fact that this great work's immense potential value to history, to posterity, and to the English-speaking world meant that it had to be done properly. Murray's papers had explained that the dictionary was all about the gathering of hundreds of thousands of quotations. It was a task that was almost unimaginably vast. Could it be done from an asylum cell? Miner was both wise enough to understand and ask himself the question, since he knew well where he was and why he was there, and then, in a partial answer, to applaud Murray for having taken the right approach to the work on which he was about to embark. Miner's own love of books and literature gave him some knowledge of dictionaries, and an appreciation of what was good and what not so good about those that had already been published. So, on reflection, he decided that he very much wanted to work for the project, and to be a part of it, not solely because it would give him something worthwhile to do, which was his first reason, but mainly because, in his opinion, Murray's plan for doing it was so self-evidently right. But Murray's plan meant that there were clearly going to be much more to his cell-bound duties than the mere enjoyment of a blissful and leisured romp through the history of published English literature. Miner needed now to pay absolutely scrupulous regard to what he read, to trawl religiously for whatever happened to be needed by Murray's team, and eventually to select from the cod of his net the very best possible entries to send away to be included in the book. Murray's notes showed him how best this might be done. Quotations, said the editor's first page, were to be written on half sheets of writing paper. The target word, the catchword, as Murray liked to call it, was to be written at the top, left. The crucial date of the quotation should be written just below it. Then the name of the author and title of the cited book, the page number, and finally the full text of the sentence being quoted. Pre-printed slips had already been prepared for some books that were important, well-known, and likely to be used a great deal. Familiar works by such as Chaucer, Dryden, Hazlitt, and Swift. Readers assigned to these books needed only write to Mill Hill to have some sent. Otherwise, Murray asked them to please write out their own slips in full, arrange them alphabetically, and send them on to the scriptorium. All this was simple enough, but, everyone wanted to ask, just what words were to be sought out? Murray's early rules were clear and unambiguous. Every word was a possible catchword. Volunteers should try to find a quotation for each and every word in a book. They should perhaps concentrate their efforts on words that struck them as rare, obsolete, old-fashioned, new, peculiar, or used in a peculiar way. But they should also look assiduously for ordinary words as well, providing that the sentence that included it said something about the use or meaning of the word. Special attention also needed to be paid to words that seemed to be new or tentative, obsolete or archaic, so that the date could be used to help fix the moment of their introduction into the language. All that, Murray hoped, was surely plain enough. But then again, asked would-be readers, how many quotations should be supplied for each word? As many as convenient, Murray wrote back, especially where different contexts tended either to explain differences in the meaning or help to illustrate the subtle variations in a particular word's usage. The more quotation slips that came into the iron shed he had built in Mill Hill, the better. He assured readers that he had an ample supply of assistants to sort them, and that his floors had been especially strengthened to hold them. More than 2 tons of slips of papers had already come in from Coleridge and Furnivall's first efforts, Murray added. But he didn't allow as to how many of them had been nibbled at by mice or ruined by damp, nor did he reveal that one batch was found in a baby's bassinet, or that a load of slips beginning with the letter I had been left in a broken-bottomed hamper in an empty vicarage, or that the entire letter F had been accidentally sent off to Florence, or that thousands of slips were so poorly handwritten that, Murray reported to a friend, it would have made for easier reading if they'd been written in Chinese. The second sheet of notes seemed to Miner at first to offer rather more practical, if much more prosaic, help. It first made clear that Murray had a fund from which he could repay the postage to those volunteers who sent packages of slips, but could not afford to do so. And it asked that the packages be sent to Mill Hill by book post, with their ends unsealed, so that Murray didn't have to pay fines for those that had been shut with even the tiniest bit of adhesive, forbidden by post office regulations. Many early readers turned out to be dreadfully confused. They simply did not understand the scope of their allotted task. For example, asked a couple of them, did every single use of the word "the" within any one book require an illustrative quote? There would be tens of thousands from any volume before any of the substantive words were even begun. And further, wailed one of the women readers, what if one had ploughed through all 750 pages of a volume, as she just had, and found not a single rare word to extract? Murray's notes offer a tolerant and genial enough response to this kind of complaint, though a faint sense of his Calvinist asperity glimmers between the lines. No, he spoke through moderately gritted teeth. There was really no need to offer scores of illustrations for definite articles and prepositions, unless the circumstances turned out to be very strange. And no. Books were not to be scoured for rare words alone. He had to remind volunteers of this fact time and again. Readers must find and note all and any words that seemed interesting, or that were quoted in interesting and signifying ways, or in ways that were good, apt, or pithy. As an example of the dangers of the process so far, he said, he'd received no fewer than 50 quotes for the word abusion, which means perversion of the truth, but had had only 5 for the much more common word abuse. My editors have to search for precious hours for quotations for examples of ordinary words, which readers disregarded, thinking them not worthy of including, he wrote. Think simple, Murray kept insisting. Think simple. And then, half exasperated that he evidently still hadn't been clear enough, he laid down a distilled version of his instruction, a golden rule, a sentence that was to become the dictionary reader's epigraph. He wanted readers simply to be able to say, this is a capital quotation for, say, heaven, or half, or hug, or handful. It illustrates the meaning or use of the word. It is a suitable instance for the dictionary.